Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And thank you to AAEI for hosting us today. My name is Laura Siegel-Rabinowitz, and I'm a shareholder with Greenberg Traurig in our New York office. And I advise companies who are importing and exporting globally, manufacturing globally with a focus on imports into the United States. Just to let everyone know, this webinar has been approved for credit for continuing education for the brokers on the line, and AAEI will send the code after the webinar. So I'm very pleased today to be joined on our panel by Heather Connor-Garofalo, who is the Senior Director for Global Trade Strategy and Productivity at Cardinal Health, where she leads the long-term planning for the company. And Heather has over 34 years experience in the trade world, including being on the AAEI Board of Governors. Also very happy to have with us today, Chris Smith, who is a trade advisor in the Customs Coordination Center for North America for IKEA. Great brand. Chris is responsible for compliance, both with CBP and with CBP's partner government agencies. So before we get started, I want everyone to see that on the bottom, there's an icon where you can type in your questions, and we'll get to them, if not during the course of our discussion, at the end of the discussion. So we can't talk about production agreements without discussing the current geopolitical situation and the new Trump administration and its impact on supply chains. Will there or won't there be tariffs on products of Canada, Mexico, China, Denmark? Will there be tariffs on specific products, such as pharma, chips, semiconductors, steel, aluminum, copper? Will there be additional tariffs on additional 2.5% on all imported products? So clearly, I mean, it's very, very fluid. to say the obvious. So my mantra really is that companies need visibility and transparency into their supply chains, which they always do, but I would say now more than ever. And companies need to be thinking, how can they protect themselves, right? And so importers need to be talking about sourcing strategies, which is exactly what we're going to be discussing today. And the role of the sourcing executives is really, the role of sourcing executives and customs compliance folks is really to protect the company and ensure compliance and mitigate that any increased duty exposure. So I think we all realize that other than for the most simple of products or commodities, that supply chains for most products are complex and they're vulnerable. And so companies have realized that they need more control over their supply chains, and they need visibility and transparency into their supply chains. And of course, the geopolitical situation impacts sourcing decisions. We saw that under the first Trump administration, where with the US-China trade war, which stayed in place under the Biden administration, clearly became a anywhere but China, sourcing strategy, right? And Vietnam, other Asian countries, Mexico certainly were beneficiaries of the US-China trade war. And then we also have the issue of forced labor, which under the first Trump administration, under the Biden administration, became the #1 enforcement issue for US customs. And I would say globally in terms of enforcement. And so companies had to start thinking, when they're thinking about their sourcing strategies, where is the risk, right? It's important for companies to know their suppliers, do their proper due diligence, monitor frequently, and always think what's in the company interest. For example, for a brand, it would be protecting the brand above all else, above all else. And in terms of, specifically for forced labor, no company wants forced labor in their supply chain. In fact, it's been a violation of US law since the 1930s to import goods or components of goods made with forced labor. So it's been around for a long time, but as everyone on the line knows, that with UFLPA in June of 22, it really was a game changer for customs. And the impact on the companies is that companies started spending lots of money in mapping their supply chains and doing a risk assessment, which I think is really important. How likely is it that shipments would be detained, right? And I really think that the effort should be commensurate with the likelihood of a detention. So again, it goes back to companies need that visibility and transparency into their supply chains. So to that end, we are going to focus today on supplier agreements. And I put under the rubric of supplier agreements, vendor codes of conduct, chargeback policies. Typically, they just cover late delivery, whether delivery is 1 or 2 weeks late. But now they need to be edited for forced labor detentions, for example. What if it's delayed 3 months because of a detention? What if the importer never actually gets their goods? So as 2025, we're into 2025, supply chains are underway for the year. Companies are dealing with increased costs. We've seen production costs go up, shipping costs, and we're not talking about the Red Sea or the Panama Canal today. And then we have that, and then we have the uncertainty with tariffs. So companies and those of us that support companies, either support the C-suite or our outside advisors, have to protect those companies, certainly reputationally, but also to be compliant with the myriad of federal and state regulations. And it just all underscores the importance of visibility into supply chains. Which leads me to my first question for Heather, which is, we're talking not only pre-production, but pre-production agreement. So in your role as the Director of Global Trade Strategy, you need to think about compliance, clearly, and also duty mitigation strategies such as first sale, drawback, using free trade agreements. So what do you advise the key stakeholders in your company discussions on supply chain and sourcing strategies?
Great. Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, everyone. So first, it's really important in the pre-work, if you will, to establish internal strategic partnerships between trade compliance and key stakeholders. So every company is a little bit different, but typically those other teams would be alliance management, business development, compliance and ethics, your engineering group, finance and tax, of course, global logistics, government affairs, very important, the legal team, of course, manufacturing, procurement and sourcing, quality, supply chain, R&D, and so forth. So you want to build those relationships in advance, but also develop clear written SOPs to clearly define ownership of the supplier relationships and communication responsibilities. So for example, when you need something from a supplier, for example, a certificate of origin, who owns that relationship? Who is going to work with the supplier to obtain the documentation that you need, but also to make sure you receive it in a timely manner? Further is implementing that supplier code of conduct, absolutely critical, right? To clearly state your expectations of your suppliers. Before I press on, Chris or Laura, would you like to add to that?
I would agree with all of that. I mean, we've developed extensive relationships, especially with risk. Our product developers who have the relationship with all of our suppliers. But for us, we also have, in connection with our supplier code of conduct, we have a group that does all of our supplier audits, and those are broken down by risk, by region and country. But for those, within that supplier code of conduct, they have to meet, we have like we call it IWay, which gives all of the expectations and requirements associated to a supplier, but we have an I must, and included in that, especially for us, are the 2 UN and the ILO standards. So all of our suppliers have to meet the 3 main, like, forced labor or standards before we will even do any business, whether that's a range supplier or a dray carrier.
And I would just add that also, I think when you're drafting these supplier codes of conduct, it's really important to tailor them to the company, right? Every company has their, for example, with DEI, how conservative or aggressive they want to be on that, in terms of worker rights and environmental protections. I find it's really company specific.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Chris. So next is acquiring a comprehensive knowledge of your company's imports and exports. Critically important to know your data, use your ERP systems, use your customs brokers data, run reports in the US in the CBP ACE system. You can obtain very detailed reports, and really understand what are you moving, where is it moving from, how is it moving, really have a complete picture of exactly what your company is doing. But also along with that is just a reminder to protect your data. So for example, in the US, Customs does release information from a vessel manifest that's available on a FOIA request or through a data mining company. So protect your data, go to the CBP website under manifest confidentiality, and we'll share the link with you after this. And you can submit a request to protect your data. So you know your data, but other people do not. Critically important for your company's privacy, but also for supply chain security and CTPAT.
And with, as Laura mentioned, with UFLPA and with the
Yes.
forced labor laws, mapping not only your flow, but the product and all of the inputs into the product is critical. That's your first line of defense when customs first detains a shipment. That'll give you the starting point to have those conversations with your suppliers on getting the transactional documentation, but the supply chain is going to be what customs is going to want to look at almost immediately.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris.
Mhm.
Next is to identify the entities that are involved. So as an example, this seller, the actual manufacturing site, a post-manufacturing site that might be final assembly or sterilization or packaging. Also, who is the buyer? When you're at a large multinational company, it's not such an easy decision in some cases, which of your entities is actually doing the buying. Who is going to be the shipper? Is it the seller or is it coming from another location? Who will act as the importer of record? Especially in your larger companies, which of your companies will act as the importer of record? Or are you buying DDP and someone else will be the importer of record? Who is the intermediate consignee? Is there an intermediate consignee? And who is your ultimate consignee? So really understand exactly who is involved. Next is to confirm and fully understand the terms of sale. Anchor terms are critical. What are the agreed anchor terms plus that location? Where will the title transfer? And is there anything else that in the agreement that might impact those items? Chris, did you want to add something before I moved on?
Incoterms can, depending on how your company wants to handle your supply chain. I know for us, we have them right into our purchase agreement, which is usually based off of what's in our supplier agreements. So we set that up right in the supplier agreements, and it gets followed through into the purchase order and then onto the invoices.
Well, thank you for that.
And I would just say, Heather, and you're, the two of you are embedded in a company that I find that C-suite executives don't really understand Incoterms. Like they kind of think they're all the same sometimes. I had a discussion just earlier today and it really impacts who has risk for the goods, who's paying the insurance, like important issues are impacted by like 3 little letters that you add to a purchase order. So sometimes I find they really need some education.
Oh,
Absolutely.
definitely. And that goes back to your partnership with the other stakeholders. I can tell you it took us a couple years to work with our quality group to get them to stop sending replacement parts and replacement pieces via DDP because our suppliers don't have an entity or a presence here. And we ended up having to clear them and take all of the additional costs that the supplier had already charged us for because they didn't have a presence.
And that's very common, not just with your company. Everywhere I've ever worked, there's been that type of a situation. Absolutely. Critical to understand your Incoterms. Often what we'll do is say to those involved in our company and any of these companies that we're speaking with is just describe what you'd like to do, and then we'll assign the Incoterm for you and help us pick the one that best meets the needs of the company. So often that's a negotiation. It's quite fun sometimes, right? Because people just pick Incoterms and they don't know what they mean. But that's where we can provide valuable assistance, of course. Thank you for that. Next is documenting your product details. It's really understanding your supply chain. Chris, you had alluded to this. What are your inputs? Where are your raw materials coming from? Where is the final good manufactured? What are the process flows? Who's involved, as we mentioned previously? The specifications for the product. What is it? What is it made of? Everything from dimensions, photos, what is the end use? Really understanding that product. Next is evaluating the suppliers. Sanction screening, obviously critical that we're screening our suppliers, that we're checking for forced labor risks, any kind of a regional risk or any kind of a regulatory risk. Chris or Laura, would you like to add to that?
I was just going to say, this is where your supply chain mapping all the way down to your inputs and as far back as you can get them is critical, because that way you can also screen those sub-suppliers in the same way you screen the entity that, you know, your main supplier that you have the contract with. But in many cases, it's the upstream sub-suppliers that your supplier is dealing with that has the issues. So having that complete map from your supplier going in to an agreement can make or break that whole agreement and keep your company safe from the get-go.
And I would just say that when you're talking to the stakeholders at your company, you talk about your product. Like, what is the import? Are you working at a solar energy company? Okay, you're having one discussion. If you're importing another tomatoes, you're having another discussion. If you're importing another product, it could be very minimal risk. So it really is important to be company specific, product specific.
Absolutely. Thank you both. So next is really ensuring trade compliance. So verifying your product descriptions, determining the customs country of origin for your goods, determining the proper classification and valuation. Further identifying which agencies are also involved. So for example, in the US, there are dozens of agencies that regulate imports and exports. So on an import, for example, you would have customs. You could have DEA or EPA, FDA, Fish and Wildlife, USDA. So really understanding which agencies are involved. And if you need any kind of a license or permit, so that you're talking about this in advance. So for current products, you have your licenses and permits in place, but for potential future products, that you understand what's required and you can apply for those permits and licenses in advance. But also looking at other requirements. Is the item subject to anti-dumping, countervailing duty? Is it subject to China sanctions, a 301 tariffs, or other requirements? So really understanding what you're currently importing, but also what you propose to start importing under that new supply agreement. Next is understanding the product's landed costs. What are the duties and fees that you're going to be paying? So what's the duty based on your classification? What is the merchandise processing fee, harbor maintenance fee? We mentioned anti-dumping and countervailing duty, China Section 301 tariffs, any tariff rate quotas, and so forth. So really understanding what those costs are, and also understanding the cost of any licenses or permits. Chris or Laura, would you like to add anything to that?
For this, I would just add, it's also, in addition to knowing what your landed cost is, it's also important to know what your customs value will be for any of your shipments coming in. Because also on top of, especially the anti-dumping or tariff rate quotas or the agency requirements, do you have any assists or royalties that you have to include in making up that customs value for your duty payments?
Absolutely.
And I would say for many products, imports of the classification, the valuation, the country of origin determination, C-level people were not that interested. But now that they're, the dollars have gone up and, and the burden has really increased and will most likely be increasing even more for most products. This sort of, I call it like the going back to basics, like is really an important discussion. I find I'm having it much more like, what is the proper classification of the good? What deductions can we take from the value? Are we capturing it? Are we compliant, but can we make it, can we shrink it in any way? So, and then let's really look, and I've seen errors with country of origin where the companies thought, oh, this was a product of China. Well, not really, so the essential character was actually made in the EU. So you just final assembly in China. That's not a country of origin China. So anyway, we're having a lot of these back to basics questions, which I think is important for companies.
And actually, country of origin is a great example, because if you're in an international organization and you're shipping to multiple countries or regions, that can change, especially if, the US has very strict and very different textile rules of origin compared to Canada, Mexico, EU, and a lot of the world. So, I mean, for us, I know we end up having either North American or US unique article numbers just to handle the legal markings associated with certain products because of textile rules of origin.
Yeah, and it's not just with textiles. I think the rules of origin globally are very different from the United States. I find in many instances the US is an outlier.
Mhm.
But it complicates matters for multinational companies.
So thank you both. Okay. And then another item that I wanted to just mention today is identifying opportunities to mitigate, to reduce duties and fees. Is there any way to save on those or defer those costs? So one of the suggestions is looking at tariff classification engineering. Is there a way to adjust the product, the manufacturing, or if it's a kit, for example, adjusting the components of your kit so that you can change the classification and obtain a lower duty rate? Another, of course, is looking at country of origin engineering, which you just mentioned. Another idea is looking at utilizing duty drawback. Are there opportunities for goods that you're importing that you will later export? Next is foreign trade zones. Could you use that to manufacture in a foreign trade zone to reduce or eliminate duty, or just defer the duties and improve your cash flow? That's also a good option that we've used in the past at other companies. Next would be looking at the miscellaneous tariff bill. If there's any opportunities for that to pass this year, and if you can have any of your goods covered under that bill, it's a great way to eliminate duty for typically 2 years. And then subject to renewal, of course. Next is to look at the China Section 301 tariff exclusions. Are you eligible for any of those exclusions? Is there any value in joining that lawsuit, which I'll defer to Laura on that one. And then finally, is just looking at your valuation, as Chris has mentioned. What is part of your value? Obviously, you want to include assist or fully dutiable, of course, but looking at your transfer pricing, are you using an accurate and complete transfer price? Is it subject to adjustment? Are you perhaps eligible to use the first sale rule to reduce that net enter value at time of entry and possibly reduce duties and fees? But also look at, when you're looking at your transfer price, when you're looking at your other valuation, really dig in and see what is included in that value. I've worked at companies where we looked at the value and we found there were costs in that value that were not dutiable. So really look carefully and see if there's any way to reduce that value. Chris or Laura, would you like to add anything?
And then once again, this is more a, are you dealing with a US, primarily US based versus international? Or how do I want to say, are you supplying other regions out of, say, the US? There, utilizing a foreign trade zone may help because you can reduce the duty impact to the downstream locations. If they're, say, Canada, Mexico, Caribbean, and you're supplying those out of a US distribution center, that distribution center can be a foreign trade zone. That reduces your downstream risk for those areas. And then once again, your Incoterms terms can help with your valuation as well, depending on how you set that up.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Go ahead, Laura.
And I would say, under the first Trump administration, there was an exclusion process. I mean, there were only additional tariffs on products of China, and there was an exclusion process. Several rounds of that. We don't know under Trump 2 what there will be. Anxiously awaiting that. I'm hopeful there'll be an exclusion process, but if there is one announced, most likely the time will be tight for comments to be submitted. But I think companies should really think about that. If there is an exclusion process saying their product is so specific, or, describe their product very specifically and say it's worthy of an exclusion to the additional tariffs. It's going to be used in manufacturing in the US or can't source it anywhere else from the country that you're getting it from. So anyway,
And I would say,
stay tuned.
And just to cap that idea off, understanding the differences between, say, a safeguard 201 or a 232 for national security on steel and aluminum versus the China 301, and now the threat with IEEPA tariffs. Each one of those get handled and rolled out differently and get applied differently. So the exclusion process really was only for China 301s. And I know for me, I mean, during Trump 1.0, I mean, probably a third to half of my time was dealing and reviewing exclusions.
And there were so many, granted at the beginning. About a third of the requests were granted, and those lists were voluminous. It was terrific to comb through those and to see, can we possibly fit? But I don't know, we'll see. The new Trump 2.0 looks to be using IEEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act. So yeah, we'll see. And Heather mentioned the 301 litigation, which is, we've just had oral argument. This is for the 301 tariffs from Trump 1. We've just had oral argument fairly recently at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. We're expecting their decision by the end of 25. But really, I'm not very hopeful. I think they'll find that that the original tariffs, the 301 tariffs, were rolled out pursuant to law. But we'll see.
Laura, I was hoping for good news there. So
yeah, we all would like good news, but yeah, I wouldn't bet on the plaintiffs in this one.
Great, thank you. So Laura, I'll send this back to you for the next question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So, Chris, when you're engaging with a new vendor and you're going to draft a production agreement, it's important to think about, like, what if this all goes south, right? For example, like, what if there is a UFLPA detention? Who's going to pay for the warehousing? And I really think it's very important to add language saying it's the importers, it's the business's decision whether or not to file a submission. It's not up to the manufacturer. And we've seen, if, for example, if there is a detention, the manufacturer and the importer do not have an identity of interest. So Chris, in your role as someone who's responsible for trade compliance, what do you advise when your company is going to be drafting a production agreement? And please mention that allocation of risk, between buyer and seller. And of course, all of this is ever complicated with the fast-changing geopolitical situation in the United States. So thank you, Chris.
As we kind of hit on it, previously under Trump's previous administration and even under Biden's administration, you had anything outside of China was good if you could move it. Now the question really is, where can you move it that may be safe or is safe? And that is all up in the air now. So, I mean, I know I'm getting questions on that and where can we possibly shift. So being on top of all of, the administration's current statements and following very closely for, when potential tariffs are being implemented can help you give better guidance to your sourcing people and those that are dealing with these contracts. We've kind of already hit on Incoterms, but that can make a huge difference and you want to put that into your production agreements. So for IKEA, we take on a lot of that ownership very early on. Our general Incoterm is CIF at the supplier. So as opposed to like X Works, once it's loaded and the dray carrier is ready to take it away from the supplier's dock, that's when we take ownership. So we're responsible for any of the dray, all of the transport. We want that control. And that also allows us to use the transfer pricing in a way which is identical to first sale for us coming into the United States. So that one move to that Incoterm versus having the supplier take that ownership and hold that ownership is very big for us. And then utilizing your trade group, your compliance group, they can help, both your risk people and to do your supplier evaluations. Are there those free trade agreements or tariff engineering opportunities based on what that production mapping that you've developed before you go into the agreement occur? We've given guidance to a number of our suppliers over the years that, hey, if you change the sourcing here, you then could become eligible for this free trade agreement with this simple shift if you have that cost. And oh, by the way, that duty savings will offset the slight increase in raw material cost. And that's where you can help leverage that potential savings. And then, as Laura mentioned, it's what critical language are you putting in? So if you're dealing with free trade agreements and there's an issue with whether or not the product qualifies, who's paying for the reimbursement to customs of duties if you have to go back and pay duties on entries that you had claimed free trade agreement status on. I've heard some attorneys suggest, can you get tariff language into your agreements so that you're splitting that liability to keep the customer end costs down? That one's probably going to be harder to get a supplier to agree to, but I've heard it suggested. And then it's ensuring or trying to ensure you're meeting all of your compliance obligations. Are you getting all of the testing? Do you have all your certificates? Are your, if you're dealing with, say, food, are your suppliers registered with FDA? All of those kind of background and other agency requirements, are they met before you even start those productions? Can they meet them? Do either of you have anything to add around?
Sure, I'd just like to add that some of the language that we've written into our contracts at the various companies I've worked for is I really stress that we add verbiage that states something to the effect of the supplier complying with our trade compliance team instructions, and we provide those instructions to them. So, for example, before the first shipment, making sure they're giving us the detailed product information to assist with that trade compliance review that we mentioned, ensuring that they're providing accurate, complete, and compliant documentation and backup to support, for example, a free trade agreement. Helping us with the OGA pre-work. We mentioned, like, for example, if I'm importing something like a pharmaceutical, that factory adds my company as a known importer. So it's prior to the first shipment. But at time of shipment, making sure they're issuing accurate, complete, timely documents and really stating what those are. We give them checklists, but it's all included, those instructions with that verbiage we put in the contracts. But then post-shipment is making sure they're cooperating with us. They're providing our annual certifications for free trade agreements, that they're notifying us of any changes. Are they making any manufacturing changes that could possibly impact the country of origin determination or a free trade agreement or license or permits? And if there's any issue with the government agency, that they're communicating with us. If they're on a sanctions list, for example, if they're on an FDA import alert, you don't want to know that your supplier is having an issue with FDA when you see them on an FDA import alert. So making sure that you have that open and clear conversation, but also making sure they're being transparent with you and including that verbiage into your agreement. Thank you.
And you mentioned manufacturing changes. That's going to be even more important coming soon, because you have the Consumer Product Safety new e-filing certificates coming up in a year and a half, 2 years, depending on if you're doing just regular entries or going through a foreign trade zone. So any changes to any of your sub-suppliers will have an effect if your product has to have that certificate of conformity, and having those updates and having them timely is going to be very important. Also, that interaction with them post entry is very critical for forced labor. I mean, being able to go back to them and have them provide those transactional documents associated with that specific entry and for those specific products is very critical and can be very time consuming. So having them know that we're expecting that if or when we have a review is very critical going in.
And so to that point, as you said, it's crucial that that language be added to the production agreements, that the company will be doing periodic reviews. You're not just going to wait for there potentially to be a detention by customs. The company will be doing periodic reviews, and the manufacturer must provide traceability documents in a timely manner. You can I put in 7 days in an agreement or whatever the company wants, but they have to be responsive. And I think it's very telling when you're adding language to a production agreement, like, we are going to do periodic reviews and expect documents from you within 7 days. If they're pushing back, well, then that's a big yellow, red flag. Should there be a detention, they may not be very cooperative. So in any case, it's really important to put that language in the agreements. And I think that potentially under Trump 2.0, we could be seeing additional audits. I think Trump views the CBP as a revenue generating source, hence the proposal to move customs from under Homeland Security back to the Treasury Department and create the External Revenue Service. So I think because of that, we could see potential additional audits, and all those, and we know Customs uses algorithms as to what companies they're going to send a request for information to or do an audit of. So, and now where you were importing, let's say, from the EU, and it was coming in at very minimal duty, and now if there are duties imposed, additional tariffs imposed, that could be a trigger. So companies that really weren't prepared to have supporting documentation now, like, this could be a wake-up call. So I think, those of us that support trade compliance and the C-suite in terms of sourcing need to make sure this language is in the agreements, that we're going to be saying country of origin is this country. We need to review periodically and determine, yeah, this is in fact the country of origin, or this is the correct valuation. So we'll see. As I said, to be continued. We'll see.
All right.
Okay, so another, we've all been doing this for for a while. So I have a question for both of you. I mean, are there any lessons that you've learned in terms of dealing with vendors and production agreements? Any mistakes you want to share where, now I know better? And I think all of that in light of what's coming, with this administration, like we can't ignore it, like, for a second, those of us in this field.
I mean, I know when we're talking about, Incoterms and that flow, I mean, I know some of the challenges we've run into is for us, in some cases, our value is based on a quarter, or what we call a tertial or a trimester period. And how does the supplier and your group handle if you've got an invoice that covers 2 production runs or 2 production periods that straddle that quarterly change in value? I mean, we've seen invoices where we've got the same article, but one is in, production week 52, and then the other is in production week 1. And now you've got 2 different unit values that that you may get questioned on, and you have to be able to prove that through the, copies of the purchase agreement and the timeframes associated with those kind of updates. So having that and knowing, your group knowing that that's a possibility is very big. And that goes back to, your stakeholder engagement.
Absolutely. And another thought is, first of all, is I receive emails constantly, whether it's this company or other companies, to comment on a contract, and people send me the section they want me to review. And I always go back and say, may I please have the entire contract? Because you need to look at the whole contract and see what is in there, right? So we're looking for compliance red flags. We're looking for assists, which we already talked about. Obviously, that can be a big problem. We'll come back to that. But we're also looking, especially in today's environment, is there anything in that agreement that would permit the company to subcontract without your permission, without your notification? So making sure that that verbiage is being called out, working with your legal team, your, and so forth, to not permit subcontracting without prior approval. And that's approval of your legal team, your quality team, your trade compliance team, so that, a change could happen that might impact that country of origin, might impact that free trade agreement or the preference program. So really making sure that that language is, there is nothing in there that permits subcontract without that prior approval. But another part is what the assist is. Most people do not know what an assist is. So that's where those relationships come in and are so important when you're speaking with other members of your company and saying, this is what an assist is, and this is why it's important. I know, and I've worked at companies where they've said, well, let me provide these raw materials to the supplier because they're so expensive and they don't want to outlay that money. So we'll buy them and ship them to them, and have a conversation with them that they understand that, one, it's fully dutiable. Someone has to track that. Do you have to make a systems enhancements to do that? Or does that have to be done manually? And I always tell them we'll never do it manually because you can't track them accurately that way if you do it manually. And what it means if you do not declare those, what the penalties mean, what it could mean for your company, but also bring in the finance and tax department. They're your best friends here, because you can also talk about will be owning materials in a foreign country. They may be subject to tax and other regulations in that country. So I use them as my partner to help convince anyone involved that we should not be providing assist to a supplier. But if you've already done so, how can we track those assists? How can we make sure that they're being declared to customs properly? And making sure that there is definitely that trade compliance responsibility, but also a tax responsibility.
Yeah,
And a
interesting.
big
Thanks,
one.
Laura.
And you mentioned about, assist. So sometimes I find companies are realize, oh yeah, we've provided tooling to the company. Yeah, we have to account for the tooling. But they don't realize that they have to account or raw materials for the transportation of those. I had that fairly recently where they were going from Europe to Asia, and yeah, you have to add in the transportation as well. And I
And
would
another
say,
big one is where is your product design or your product development happening? I mean, IKEA, we're all of our production design and development is done in Sweden. So every article we bring in, we're adding a development, engineering development assist on everything we bring in because all of that is done in Sweden, not here. So that value we have to add in to develop that customs value.
yeah, that's right. Companies really forget about design. I would say also in terms of lessons I've learned is I find that company executives really have no idea how onerous customs penalties can be. They don't know about customs enforcement at all. And when I tell them, 2 times the owing duty or 4 times the owing duty, they're like, what? Like, or up to the value of the merchandise, like, this
Or
is
double the value of the goods, depending on which is more.
Or, right, exactly. So it's like, are you kidding me? Like, I had no idea that customs would do this. I thought, oh, yeah, we pay our duties and that's it. So anyway, I think that's really in conversations with the stakeholders, that's really an important, and by the way, if things are not done correctly, this is what could happen. So it's very eye-opening.
And understanding that, the right to import, it's not guaranteed. It could be taken away. So when people ask me, like, do we really need to do that? My answer is, would we like to import that product? And if the answer is yes, then we must do this. It's a requirement. It's not optional. So absolutely.
I have another question for the two of you. Have you thought about, because of the potential impending tariffs under this administration, about your bond and how
Oh,
it's
yeah.
going to be impacted?
We get our bond under Trump one, the first administration went up significantly. We are definitely going to be reviewing that regularly, especially this first year, but probably all 4 years, as the potential for more and more tariffs could happen. But for us, and we have a very substantial bond already because of between anti-dumping tariffs, the China tariffs specifically. So in Trump 1.0, like we had almost 40% of our volume was coming in from China. So when we hit into lists 3 and 4, that had a big impact on our duty liability and our bond amount. So yeah, for Mexico and China, any additional tariffs there, we'll definitely be doing that, and we'll be looking out on that on our year estimate, not just a monthly, because we would much rather do a large update to the bond than have to go back and try to adjust it, on a regular basis or a more often basis.
That's a big lesson learned for me. So before I moved to the importer side, I was a customs broker. for 10 years. And when I first moved over, I remember receiving a notice from Customs regarding bond sufficiency. And I should have known better, right? Because I worked for a broker for 10 years. And ever since then, it's something I'm so careful about. So typically check the bonds quarterly, but under this new administration, we'll be checking much more frequently because of the impact on our company. So absolutely critically important. We really usually assign it to a certain person, and it's part of their routine. So they're routinely
Yep.
checking, reporting back to the group. You know, this is where we are today. Do we need to make any adjustments so we can be proactive about that? But that's actually a great question. And again,
Yep.
a major lesson learned for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. All you need is one of those bond
One.
insufficiently letters, and you do not forget that lesson.
I'll never
Yeah,
forget.
and I don't think I had seen them until Trump won with companies. That's when I started seeing those letters.
Yeah, because a lot of companies didn't even think of it affecting their total duty liability. So yeah, until then, a lot of companies really didn't check it on a regular basis.
Chris, do you have any final thoughts, either of you?
Bruce, would you like to go first?
Kind of in line with, the concerns with this, if your company does any like co-branding or is using intellectual property from other companies, ensuring that any royalty payments are included in your price valuations, but also that your trade group understands that and knows that, so that your compliance group can make sure and use that in any of their reviews, both when the entry arrives, but also post-entry.
Thanks, Chris. For me, I cannot stress enough how important those relationships are. You know, with what's happening with the incoming administration is making sure that you're having routine check-ins with those key stakeholders. A task force, if you will. There's probably a better term for that, but that's what it feels like right now. And that we're talking about what's happening, what we think is going to happen, where we are today, why it's so important that we're keeping in touch, and that we're really being careful about understanding our supply chain, but if we decide to make changes, understanding what those potential changes could mean, right? How it will impact what we're doing today and into the future. So really those relationships are absolutely critical. Thank you for that. And thank you so much for those who joined us today. Back to you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone who's listened to us today. Thank you to Chris and to Heather. Thank you to AEI. Here's some additional information from AEI, and we'll see you soon. Oh, here's some more save the dates from AEI. Okay, all right. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.